These are the stories of ordinary British people, told through their diaries, letters, and memoirs, as their lives were changed forever by what they called the Great War.
That first dead soldier is a sight that is practically photographed on my brain on the sloping side of the crater, like somebody's son.
I rushed forward. I learned afterwards that the first two men behind me had been wounded and the third killed.
After nearly 4 years of fighting, either side could still win the war, and nobody knew who would be left standing when the end did finally come.
I feel it's getting more and more of a nightmare. Why can't they see what it's all coming to?
I collapsed with the misery of you in the battle, and that I must drag on not hearing from you for days, and that the torture of my mind must go on indefinitely. I love you. I love you. Diana.
Uncovered from attics and basements, archives and libraries, these original accounts are here brought back to life like never before. (1917). War had been raging for nearly 3 years on 3 continents, from the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Poland and the Eastern Front, from the Dardanelles and Gallipoli to the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea. But of all the far-flung theatres of war, by far the largest and most important was the Western Front in France and Belgium. Here, in the mud of the trenches and the bloodiest battles of British history, this war was to be decided. Men were now called up who had reserved occupations, jobs like shipbuilding or mining, previously thought vital to the war effort. 19-year-old Arthur Roberts was an apprentice in a Glasgow shipyard, the son of a chimney sweep's daughter and a Caribbean ship's steward. He was one of the few black people in Scotland. Arthur had volunteered in 1916. Only now was he released from work.
At last, I've started on the way to the front. The draft left me great excitement and playing of bands. Major Harris was crying on the platform as he waved his handkerchief. As I left Edinburgh, I wondered if I'd ever see it again.
Arthur was sent to a city in Belgium, around which the British lines bulged into German territory. Ypres. It had already been the scene of 2 great battles.
The day dawned with the usual chilly mist. What a lovely day it was. How quiet everything was. As I meandered along, mechanically following the twists and turns of the trench, turning a corner, my absent-minded gaze alighted on. Oh heavens. That first dead soldier is a sight that is practically photographed on my brain. In the first instant I saw every detail, but the very horribleness of the sight kept my eyes riveted longer on the gruesome thing. The shell had burst right in the middle of the trench, so that now, for several yards, there was no trench. On the sloping side of the crater lay somebody's son.
Arthur was one of 100,000 troops massing around Ypres. The British were preparing for a major attack. The search for new soldiers reached into the corridors of power. 27-year-old Alfred Duff Cooper had not yet been released from work at the Foreign Office.
The government want more men for the army, and we in the Foreign Office are all to be medically examined. And I think they'll have to let some of us go. If anyone is allowed to go, I shall be, as I'm the youngest of the permanent staff, unmarried, and I should think perfectly fit. The thought fills me with exhilaration. I'm not afraid of death, and though I love life and would hate to lose it, the only drawback is the terrible blow it would be to Mother. I don't know how I should dare tell her.
All across Britain, people were feeling the weight of 3 years of war, with no sign of victory.
Everyone is so war-weary. That first wonderful spirit of patriotism seems to have died down. The whole outlook is new. The whole world seems new since the war. When we speak of pre-war days, it seems like 100 years ago.
I feel it's getting more and more of a nightmare. Why can't they see what it's all coming to? The bitterness of class against class has never been as it is now. After all, the poor man probably doesn't grudge the rich one his motor or his 2 or 3 country houses. But he does grudge him his food and his lavish hotel dinners, while his own children are literally starving for milk or sugar, and his wife spends her whole day waiting in vain in food queues.
I very seldom go out to any festivities nowadays, but today I went out to tea at the Criterion with some friends, as in the days of old. How changed everything was since I was last there. The orchestra played, as usual, but it seemed so sad. After tea, we went and sat in the park, and this was the saddest part of all. It would naturally have been the height of the season, but nearly every chair was empty. It was like a new, and tragic world. And I wished I had not gone there.
How horrible this is. When I think of Oxford, I see nothing but ghosts. I suppose there are other people who have lost as many friends as I, but it seems hardly possible.
I'm already impressed.
The son of a doctor, Duff Cooper had long been hopelessly in love. Lady Diana Manners was the daughter of the Duke of Rutland, one of the grandest and richest aristocrats in Britain. She had been raised to marry nobility or royalty, and not a man like Duff, though that didn't stop him trying.
The sandwich, I'll wait for you to get yours.
I always meant to ask you whether you would marry me or not. Probably not. I am mouse poor and should be a vile husband. So I could promise at the altar to endow you with nearly all my worldly goods, which wouldn't amount to much. Think it over at the end of the season.
Please, Mother, you're so unreasonable.
However much Duff and Diana grew to love each other, they knew the Duke and Duchess would never agree to her marrying a doctor's son.
I'm not interested.
But in 3 years of war, most of the eligible young men in Diana's circle had been killed. And now Duff came to tell her his news.
I confessed to her that I was really glad to join the army, which made her cry. She was so white and darling and pathetic. I explained to her that it was no nonsense about dying for my country or beating the Germans that made me glad to join, but simply the feeling I have had for so long that I'm missing something. The vague regret that one feels when not invited to a ball, even though it be a ball that one hardly would have hoped to enjoy.
Duff had to leave for training camp and would soon be sent to the front. Diana had to face the possibility that he might never return.
Darling Duffety, I have had such acute pen paralysis that I am fearful of having lost you totally. It is with effort and suffering that I write now. It's all this war, I say. Robbing me of all I love, robbing you of all my care. I thank God for you perpetually. The only survivor, presumably, in this mammoth wreck. Thank you for coming to see me, darling.
July 1917. At Ypres, the British were about to begin one of the most terrible battles in their history, to try to break the German lines and capture the strategic ridge of Passchendaele. On the 31st, the biggest attack began since the Battle of the Somme. Over 3,000 guns fired over 4 million shells at the German trenches, before thousands of men went over the top. The British Army was supported by its imperial troops, including thousands from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The Germans were well prepared. Arthur Roberts was close to the place the soldiers called Hellfire Corner.
Boom, bang, crash, crash, whiz, boom. A German battery was registering on the road with every shot. At the outset, the officer came running down the line shouting, "Steady, boys!" He was among the first to be hit. We hesitated a few moments, but the deadly precision with which the shells landed was too much for us. The fire swept down towards us like a hurricane. In fact, it was a typhoon of splinters and death. To run was as bad as to stand. There was literally nothing but to fling ourselves into the ditches. My God, what a sight. Bodies lay dotted along it. Big shell holes gaped here and there, but worse than all, the moans and shrieks of the unfortunate men.
Heavy rain turned the low-lying battlefield into a quagmire.
Imagine a belt of land all churned up into heaps and hollows. Imagine next that into all the hollows has been poured a thick soup, 1 to 2 feet deep. There, our men had to stand in drizzling rain for 6 days and nights. Legs caked in mud, boots reduced to paper, nerves on edge, sick with apprehension and shock. The whole place was floating in mud and heroism.
It's bad luck that we should have rain today. For goodness knows the conditions are terrible up here. The battalion went into line for 48 hours, and it was one of the worst experiences during all my time out here.
The sights I saw, well, I could write a book with 50 pages in it. I saw motor lorries sunk in the mud over their wheels, and the dead. Oh, I've never seen so many before. We're burying them as quickly as possible, but the weather has been so bad that a lot of them buried in the bogs. It is murder, not war.
By the time the battle ended in November, 250,000 Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded. They had advanced only around 5 miles. Losses on the German side were as high as 400,000, and their commanders realized they couldn't afford another defensive battle. But now the Russian Revolution brought an end to the war between Germany and Russia in the east, and Germany transferred hundreds of thousands of men to the Western Front. The Germans planned to gamble everything on one last huge offensive in the spring, to deliver a knockout blow to the British and the French. Londoner Thomas Poole had lost his oldest son on the first day of Passchendaele. Now he risked losing his youngest. The government had extended conscription to all able-bodied men between 18 and 51, and Thomas's son Ted, just 18, was called up and began training.
Dear Father, just a few lines in answer to your letter, which I received today. When I go on parade, I've got to wear my belt, bayonet and cartridge pouch, and also take the rifle. You ought to see me in my shrapnel helmet and gas mask. It would make you laugh, especially as the helmet wobbles from side to side every time I walk. I think with this hard training, they'll either make a man of me or kill me. After we'd been marching about 1¼ hours, the officer suddenly threw down a smoke bomb and called out gas. We at once had to halt and put our gas masks on as quick as possible. And then we had to march about ½ a mile in the gas mask. Perhaps this doesn't sound very much, but I can tell you that you sweat like hell.
In the countryside, as in the cities, more and more women were taking on jobs previously done by men. Farms were struggling to keep up food production, and into the breach stepped the land army of women volunteers. One of them was 24-year-old Helen Bentwich, from a wealthy family in North London. Before the war, she'd never have dreamt herself a farmhand.
I've been ploughing the last few days, and I'm doing quite well now. It's not hard work, just knack and knowing how to manage the horses. The bailiff rode up on his horse to watch me the first day and said I was ploughing the plough so hard I could do without the horses. Now I don't push, only glide. And I can ride the farm horses now without falling off. Even in the rain and thunderstorms we've been having, I'm loving it all. But I'm also working in the dairy. Ooh, I don't much like milking. It's so stuffy and smelly having to keep one's head under the cow for so long at a time. And they're unattractive beasts compared to the horses.
Ships bringing in food supplies from abroad were being sunk by German U-boats, and so the land army was ever more important to feeding the nation.
We are full of courage and hope. Every fresh acre brought into cultivation is a fresh victory for ourselves and a new blow to the enemy.
We were given out by army lorry each morning to fields to pull flax for airplane wings and linseed oil. Lined across the fields, we pulled it up and laid it down. A farmer came along one day and gave us a flagon of cider.
Helen was making the most of her new life.
Oh, I must make a confession. I bought a motorbike. It's a bit lazy at times and sits down and sulks on hills, and I have a hard job making it up. The starting it is the worst difficulty, as I have to run with my legs straddled across it to make it start. And doing this uphill is tiring. But I'm strong and will soon get used to it, though at present I'm fairly bruised, in parts.
From the top to bottom of society, people stepped up and did their bit for the war effort. Some months earlier, Lady Diana Manners had defied her parents and volunteered as a nurse in London.
My mother drove me down, sorrowing and silent, to Guy's Hospital. It was a grey, cold day. I do not think my mother was at all proud of me. She just hated the sordid, unvirginal aspect of it all, and the loss of authority and protection. Guy's looked very Dickensian that afternoon beneath its dark drizzle. My first job was to clean the glass trolley. The fear and dislike of asking where things are impede one's speed the first day. Clean it with the meth, nurse. Where's the meth kept, one wondered. I seem to have done nothing practical in all my 20 years.
Duff's first experience of barracks was also a shock. After his life of privilege.
My darling, I shall not see you for a long time. I sleep in a room with 7 others. I have to walk half a mile through stone passages to a public washing place. The food I will not attempt to describe. I shall grow nice and thin. At least, not nice, but coarse and red and horrible. All this, however, I mind not at all, compared with the separation from you.
Army discipline was strictly enforced on all the new conscripts.
We've got a lot of prisoners in the next room to us. When I say prisoners, I mean boys who have run away and been caught. And you ought to see how they guard them. When they have their meals, there are 2 or 3 soldiers round them with fixed bayonets. And if one of them wants to go to the WC, a soldier goes with him. And there are 2 soldiers outside the door of our block with fixed bayonets day and night.
Having survived Passchendaele, Arthur Roberts had been transferred to a supply camp. There he was accused of what seemed a trifling offence, but which the army took very seriously.
I have to appear before the officer commanding on the charge of willfully destroying a pair of boots. I can safely swear I've done nothing of the sort. I was told to report at 1 p.m. and with my escort, for I was under arrest, marched into the OC's office. He listened to the evidence against me but refused to see my witnesses. He then asked me if I'd accept his punishment. I instantly refused it. He gave me the option of his punishment or a court-martial. I chose the court-martial. I was marched off to the guard room to await my trial. During my confinement, I worked out my defence.
If convicted, Arthur could face imprisonment. And in early 1918, the British Army needed every man it could get. Germany now held the initiative for the first time since the beginning of the war. Using fresh troops transferred from the Eastern Front, German commanders planned a devastating attack to break through the lines and split the British and French armies apart. Duff would soon find himself in France and on his way to the fighting. Before he set off for the front, he wrote one more letter to Diana.
I'm starting in a few minutes, and I'm going to ride there. I had always imagined a long, exhausting march to the trenches, but it is pleasant and romantic to be able to ride there comfortably after tea.
My darling, I have endured great physical pain today. Hip and thigh, calf and foot. Wards claim one from 7:30 a.m. to 8 p.m. and with the exception of 3/4 for lunch and half for tea, during which I hung my legs in cold water just to calm them, one is never off one's feet. At the tea half hour, feeling terribly weak, I found in its pigeonhole a letter from you. And for the first time in years, I cried and cried with joy. And then, my darling, its news, when other petty woes had done their worst, overthrew me. I collapsed with the misery of you in the battle, and that I must drag on not hearing from you for days, and that the torture of my mind must go on indefinitely. Keep warm, baby. Diana.
In early 1918, there was an eerie calm along much of the Western Front. The Germans were preparing their surprise attack. At his supply camp, Arthur Roberts was fighting the charge that he had destroyed a pair of boots. His officer commanding had threatened him with court-martial.
About 4:45 p.m., the police came to escort me to the office again. The OC now told me there was not enough evidence to convict me and that I had escaped his punishment by a bold stroke. My sheet is still clean, but it was a close shave. I'm naturally very elated by my success because the corporal who charged me is not a popular man. Surprised more than him on the quiet.
Arthur could now go back to work, only just in time. On March the 21st, 1918, the Germans launched what was called their Kaiser's Battle. Suddenly, the deadlock of the trenches was broken. The British found themselves mounting a desperate rearguard action across the former battlefields of the Somme, defending the vital French city of Amiens. For Germany, this could have been their last chance to win the war. They were running out of men, resources, and time. As well as the British, French, and British Empire armies, they faced a new enemy, the United States. America had joined the war in 1917, and American troops were beginning to arrive at the Western Front in huge numbers. Duff would soon be at the heart of the fighting. Like countless other soldiers, he took a moment to write what could be his last letter to his beloved.
You surely, darling, have never doubted how madly proud and wildly happy I should always have been and always will be to marry under any conceivable conditions. So, I propose to you again. It is just 5 years since I did so first, by letter in fun. Do you remember? I can still remember your answer. I wonder what it will be this time. Whatever it is, my life, it cannot make me love you more. Duff.
My beloved angel. Such a wonderful letter this morning about our marrying. It was my cure. My wings, my darling Duff with me. I feel it may be so. My darling, you know that I would marry you and love you for years, and that I would fly to you with the jubilance and excitement of a child. But so far for you and me there is no betrothing. No, nothing. Your letter gave me many castles to build all day. I do not dare allow them. They will tempt this fortune, who will whirl you out of life and my sight in revenge for my forgetting her. I love you. Love you. Diana.
The German offensive failed. Then, at 3:30 a.m. on August the 8th, the Allied counterattack began. The Germans called that day the Black Day of the German army. The coming weeks would see much desperate fighting, and Duff was in the middle of it.
We started off at the right time. The mist was so thick you could only see for about 20 yards. Suddenly, we noticed an enemy machine gun shooting through the hedge in front of us. We'd almost walked into it. We hurried back, and on the way we were fired at by machine guns from the other side of the railway. Fryer told me to take a Lewis gun and a couple of sections and capture or knock out the machine gun. It was rather an alarming thing to be told to do. However, I got my Lewis gun up to within about 80 yards of it, creeping along the hedge. The Lewis gun fired away. When it stopped, I rushed forward. I learned afterwards that the first two men behind me had been wounded and the third killed. The rest had not come on. I dropped a few yards away from the gun I was going for and crawled up to it. Presently, I saw two men moving cautiously below me. I called to them, in what German I could at the moment remember, to surrender and throw up their hands. They did so immediately. They obviously did not realize that I was alone. They came up the cutting with their hands up, followed to my surprise by others. There were 18 or 19 in all. If they had rushed me, they would have been perfectly safe, for I could never hit a haystack with my revolver, and my own men were 80 yards away. However, they came back with me, like lambs.
Finally, German strength and morale was breaking. The Allies fought their way forward remorselessly.
Jerry is hopelessly routed. All along the line, things are going A1. It's amazing to see Jerry running away. But I will give him his due. He puts up a bit of a scrap before he is compelled to move.
It almost seems that Germany hasn't much of a kick left now. But I hope there are enough fresh troops behind us this time to keep things moving.
Ted Poole was sent in for the final push.
Well, Father, I've slept in some different places since I've been in the army. But this is quite a novel experience, to have to ride and sleep in a cattle truck, which I've had to do since I landed here Wednesday. I can't say I like tents very much. When you get 14 of you and your equipment in one tent, it is a bit crowded.
Ted arrived at the front near Cambrai, ready for an attack on the Germans' last line of defense.
Just a few lines to tell you I'm getting on all right. No, Father, I have left the base. Yes, you will want the home fires burning soon, now the winter is coming on. I know it's jolly cold of a night time out here. I woke up the other night and my feet nearly frozen, and the cramp all up one leg. The other night I was on guard over one of our boys who was doing 14 days field punishment for stealing apples. Well, Father, I don't think I've any more news to tell you just at present. Hoping this will find you in the pink. I remain your loving son, Ted.
Finally, an end to the war was in sight. And yet, fighting would continue to the very last moment.
It is my painful duty to inform you that a report has been received from the War Office notifying the death of Private Ted Poole. The report is to the effect that he was killed in action.
Ted Poole was just one of 260,000 Allied soldiers killed in the last 100 days of war. Half of the British Army's losses in 1918 were soldiers under 19 years of age. The First World War had lasted for 4 years, 3 months, and 7 days. Over 700,000 British people had been killed, and over 1.5 million wounded. Over 1 million French soldiers were dead, and over 2 million Germans. Across Britain, there were 160,000 widows and 300,000 fatherless children. Nearly 1 in 5 of all British men had been killed or wounded. But finally, Germany asked for an armistice. On November the 11th, in his office in London, Winston Churchill, as he would do many more times later in his life, bore witness to history.
It was a few minutes before the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. I stood at the window of my room, looking up Northumberland Avenue towards Trafalgar Square, waiting for Big Ben to tell that the war was over. And then, suddenly, the first stroke of the chime. I looked again at the broad street beneath me. It was deserted. Then, from all sides, men and women came scurrying into the street. Streams of people poured out of all the buildings. The bells of London began to clash. The tumult grew. It grew like a gale, but from all sides simultaneously. The street was now a seething mass of humanity. Flags appeared as if by magic. Streams of men and women flowed from the embankment. Almost before the last stroke of the clock had died away, the strict, war-straightened, regulated streets of London had become a triumphant pandemonium.
As I walked in the streets, the sights I saw and the sounds I heard were unbelievable. The bells of St. Martin's and other bells were clanging and clashing. The buses and taxis had people riding anyhow and anywhere. Nearly everybody carried or wore flags and waved them wildly as they walked along. Perfect strangers smiled to each other and said, "Isn't it glorious?" and some even kissed each other in the street.
Glorious news that you have done fighting is almost more than my head can stand. And now we're waiting every day to hear of that long-awaited reunion. Oh, what a day that will be. Peace at last seems too good to be true. We can hardly realise that the war is over. All shops and offices closed immediately and the streets were thronged with people. You could walk on their heads.
With thoughts of the past come thoughts of those good chaps who were then with us, but have now departed for all time, having paid the supreme price for the cause of freedom.
Duff Cooper was already in London on leave.
In spite of real delight, I couldn't resist a feeling of profound melancholy, looking at the crowds of silly, cheering people and thinking of the dead. The streets were full of wild enthusiasm. Diana shared the melancholy with which these filled me, and once she broke down and sobbed.
After so much bitter loss, it was unnatural to be jubilant. The dead were in our minds, to the exclusion of the survivors. The armistice, so prayed for, seemed a day of mourning.
Of course, amidst all these scenes of rejoicing, I have noticed many sad and tearful faces too. For instance, whilst we were hanging out the flags from our windows, we saw a woman sobbing at her window opposite.
Gradually, over the coming weeks and months, the soldiers came home. Families were reunited. Men went back to their old jobs. Arthur Roberts returned to Glasgow and the shipyards.
According to my discharge, my military qualifications are nil. At that rate, I think nothing short of being Commander-in-Chief allows one to have a military qualification. Truly, a soldier's life is a tangled skein of ways and means to curious ends.
For Helen Bentwich, war had in some ways changed Britain for the better.
We have at last realised that woman is an animal with two legs, who don't come to any harm if they're exposed as such, instead of pretending she's a sort of head on a pedestal. So we wear breeches, openly and unashamedly, a smock or coat to just above our knee, and we have a vote, too, if we're over 30. So you see, it's you men what are the back numbers now.
Helen was well placed to make the most of the new freedoms. She became active in politics.
One evening, I paced around putting Labour manifestos into the letterboxes of all the most Tory people in the neighbourhood, who should read them for the good of their souls. I'm hardly on speaking terms with Father. To him, all Labour politicians are Bolsheviks. But he only reads the Times.
Duff asked the Duke and Duchess of Rutland for Diana's hand in marriage. They eventually relented.
Good evening. Come.
Today I was married. There was a great crowd outside St. Margaret's, an incredible crowd. I felt no tinge of nervousness. I felt only pride. and love. My only sorrow and shame was the appearance of Hermione, my sister, who looked like a mad tart of the year 2000 AD. There were fortunately no tears shed by either mother, and we all went as merry as possible.
Never were two people as happy. But we must not rest on our laurels. Duff had always had political ambitions, but for him to leave the Foreign Office needed money. Money had to be spun from somewhere, even for the life that we were living. We had what was considered the minimum of servants. 5 for the 2 of us.
One of the last entries in Hallie's war diary was about a visit to an exhibition which showed how objects scavenged from former battlefields could be usefully recycled.
The shell-torn uniforms from the battlefields nearly made us weep, although beneath were exhibited their new and beautiful usefulness. In a way, it was a sort of allegory of the whole war. For it really seems as if a new world is being created out of all the ruin and desolation and mistakes and sorrows and sacrifices of this great tragedy.
These have been just a handful of diaries and letters written by those who lived and died during the First World War. Over 10,000 are held at the Imperial War Museum, and many more in attics or basements, archives and libraries from north to south across Britain. The legacy of the story they tell lives on.
Well, you can read more about the people featured in the programme in the book of the series, The Great War, The People's Story, out now in all good bookshops. The first of 2 brand new films on ITV next weekend sees Paddy Considine star in The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, Sunday at 9:05. And tomorrow at 9, with the last in this series, Davina McCall and Nikki Campbell help end decades of heartbreak in Long Lost Family. Next, the latest ITV news.